Awesome. I think we can get started right now,
Yeah.
and we can obviously have them join in. Hi everyone, welcome to the very exciting UX workshop that we're conducting as part of the Tyk Side Project Fund initiative. So for those of you who do not know, we at Tyk have launched a micro grant program for supporting side projects. So if you have a side project and you want to apply for funding, you can do so right now at tyk.io/fund. I'll send you an email with the website link shortly after we get the recording live. With that said, I'd like to officially welcome you all to this UX workshop. Today we have with us Sophie, who's Tyk's UX lead, who will be facilitating this workshop. Thanks, Sophie, for joining us. She's going to talk us through key elements of creating a great user experience for your project and give us some really practical tips and great UX advice based on her experience. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Sophie to lead the session. Over to you, Sophie.
Hey. So yeah, let me just share my screen.
Mm-hmm.
Can you see that? Cool. So yeah, as Shreya said, I am going to just walk you through some of the basics of UX, what UX means, and a kind of framework that you can use in any project. It's not specific to any type of project. It doesn't have to be a web project or an app project or anything, any project. So just some tips and ideas for you to kind of adopt a user-centered mindset to create a really good user experience in any of the projects that you're working on. So just some of the things I'm going to cover, the fundamentals of UX, so a brief definition, and then I'm going to walk you through a design thinking toolkit. It's got some elements that you can use, pick and choose from to use throughout your projects to make sure that you're kind of thinking of the users as you go through every aspect of your project. I'm going to touch on some key usability aspects, and I'm also going to talk about how you can then measure UX at various points in your project as well. And then we've got some time at the end for a Q&A. So diving right into it, what actually is UX design? There are a lot of different definitions out there. Lots of people have their own ideas of what UX is. So just at a really high level, stripping it back to the basics, design on its own it's the purpose, planning, and intent of making something. The term user experience wasn't actually coined until the 90s, but we all know that design has been around for hundreds and thousands, millions of years, because everything is designed. So UX design is kind of follows on from that principle, but it's about putting the user at the very heart of that purpose, planning, and intent that is the foundation of design. The definition of user experience that I kind of like the most, and it's from the Nielsen Norman Group, which again, they're the people that coined the term user experience. User experience encompasses all aspects of an end user's interaction with the company, its services, and its products. Feel free to jump in if you have any questions at any point throughout any of this as well. I'm not going to you don't have to listen to my voice for the next half an hour. So yeah, and you can read more about that, provided the link here. I'm sure we can share the slides with you afterwards as well. So it really is about adopting a user-centered mindset. And what I want to drive home here is that you really don't need to be a UX designer, a graphic designer, any sort of designer to adopt this mindset. It's really about just changing the way you think, putting the user at the center. And I'm going to walk through a few kind of examples of how you can do that. The reason that this is important is we want to kind of move away from, in a lot of aspects, moving away from delivering technical point solutions that fix one particular issue to actually delivering kind of human-centered experiences that solve real problems. Because at the heart of user experience is that user, and human beings we know are powered by emotion rather than reason in a lot of cases. So it's really important to just kind of understand what experience you want them to be having when using your product. So one of the things that we can do to kind of get thinking in this way and adopting this mindset is by using something called design thinking. I don't like to think of design thinking as a process, as it's sometimes called in some of these diagrams. This is just a Google search, and these are all the images that come up when you type in design thinking. We at Tyk have adopted our own kind of a version of design thinking, and that's something I'm going to walk through today. But yeah, so design thinking to me is it's a process. It's not a process, it's a mindset and a framework and a toolkit to kind of get you thinking with the user at the heart there. So at Tyk, we start off with the direction, we then move into understanding, defining, reframing, ideation, iteration, and then build. I'm going to walk through some of these steps. As we go through these steps, the scope of thinking kind of it gets bigger and smaller at each point, and it's worth noting you don't have to do this in any particular order. If you've started your side project and you've kind of jumped into a build phase, that's absolutely fine. You can kind of take some different elements about understanding your user and then iterating that back into the build. So definitely don't worry if you kind of think, oh, I've jumped right to the end. It's not like that at all. It's not linear. You can jump in and out at any point and use what's useful to you at whatever point you are in your project. So there are some tools here that are really useful for making sure that you're solving the right problem for your user. So making sure that your project is kind of going to be useful and going to be valuable for the people that you're building for. And then the other part of it is about solving the problem, right? So that's where we start thinking about things like usability and making sure that people can actually complete the tasks in the most appropriate way. So I'm going to start off with the understand phase. The initial direction you've got already for your side projects, there was something that kind of sparked that initial idea that you had to actually get going on that project and be passionate enough. That's the direction that every good project needs. Just the spark and the passion to be able to and to want to do something in your spare time. That's kind of the initial point of success for any project. So going into understanding your users, here's an example that I really love about why understanding your users is so important and what a difference it can really make. So the guy that you can see here is Doug Dietz. He's an industrial designer at GE Healthcare. Probably doesn't work there anymore, but did a fair few years ago. He was the lead designer for a new MRI machine, and that MRI machine won multiple industry awards for both functional design and engineering. It was really quick, it was quieter than most other machines, and yeah, produced really good results for the function that needed an MRI scan to be. What he actually realised, he got invited into a children's hospital where this scanner was just about to be used, and what he saw actually quite upset him. The children and the parents were afraid. It was a difficult situation they were in. There was obviously a scary time for them as a family. And what he noticed for the hospital as well, that there ended up being longer delays, high rescheduling rates, and then high resource demands because the kids would maybe need sedating because they were too scared to go into the MRI machine. So he kind of took a step back and thought, I'm not really solving the problem that I set out to solve, which was improving the efficiency and just making the best MRI machine I can for the hospital. So he took a step back and started thinking about the users and the context a bit more. Something he did is he went to go and visit lots of different happy situations that children often spend time in. So he went to playgroups, he went to museums, and he saw kind of what aspects kind of really get children excited and what make them happy, so that he could try and then feed that back into the design of what's actually quite a scary experience of having an MRI scan. So what he actually came up with was something called the Adventure Series. So it's actually the same machine. There was really limited funding. But what they did is they incorporated a story around this experience of going and having this MRI machine experience. And all that happened was he just gained that extra additional understanding and empathy for the users that were using that product. And he's kind of turned it into something that made that experience kind of 10 times better than it was before, and actually solved the problems for the hospital as well as the actual children who were using the product as well. So just something to show that having empathy and understanding for your users really can have a really big impact on the success of the product or the project or the service that you're providing. So that kind of leads into my point of, if you design for everyone, then you end up delighting no one. So it's really easy to kind of, when you're starting a new project, you kind of think, oh, this will be amazing and everyone will use it, and so I'm just going to design it for everyone. And that can be great, and that can happen at some point down the road. But as you're starting out in something, you really need to kind of focus in on who you really want to target for this product or service or project that you're working on. So one of the ways that you can do that is building empathy is kind of the main aspect of this. And there are lots of different ways and approaches and techniques that you can use. So empathy, and what you can see on the right hand side of the screen here is an empathy map. And the way that you can start collecting data for something like an empathy map, which is just a way of kind of writing out the experiences and the thoughts and the feelings of your users, is to conduct interviews, observe users in the natural habitat of the environment that you're trying to improve with your product or service. And some techniques when you're going through those processes, when you're interviewing people or having a discussion or asking questions, try and, instead of asking direct questions, maybe use open prompts. So instead of saying, did you have a good day yesterday? You can say, describe your day yesterday. So that's one technique. So just slightly changing the language of the way that you ask questions in order to get more response back and more kind of emotive responses back from the people that you're trying to get some information from. Now, part of that process is embracing awkward silences. It's a really kind of awkward at first, but it's a really great technique for getting more information out of people than they initially would think that they would want to give you. So they might have an answer in mind for a specific series of questions that you have, but if you kind of sit back and kind of, you can make some facial expressions but not ask the next question, it might prompt that person to then just start talking a bit more and expand a bit more on what they were saying, without you necessarily having to give a direct prompt and question for them to do so. If people also just embrace the awkward silence, then you can just ask why. That's another great technique, to just keep asking why, because you'll just get to the bottom and the root of the problem more that way. Another technique is to ask them to introduce storytelling techniques. So again, instead of asking someone a direct question, you can ask them to imagine a situation where, and then get them to explain that way. So kind of get them thinking in a more imaginative state, rather than asking about direct experiences or direct ideas that they have. When you're doing observations, this is really good if you're kind of working on a project or a product that's kind of out in the open space, that's easy for you to go and kind of observe without looking like a bit of a strange person. But the main thing there is to really keep out of the way, let people go about their natural business and kind of start to see where their pain points are, start to see where they're struggling, start to see the things that they really enjoy doing. And you can take all of those things and feed them into something like an empathy map here, so you can really start to pick out areas of opportunity or areas of pain that you can start to solve with your project. And the last point here is that around 3 to 5 users is generally enough. People often think, oh, I'm not going to do user research because I don't have access to that many people. If you're going down this route of the more qualitative research, then 3 to 5 really is enough, because you'll tend to start, after about three or 4 users, you'll start to hear the same insights coming out or observe the same insights, if you've constrained your kind of scenario down enough. And any more than that, you'll start to kind of get very repetitive, and it gets to a point where it's wasting your time a bit to keep getting the same information back. Following on from that, you can then start to kind of, if you've noticed some commonalities in traits of all the different things that you've picked up on the interviews and the observations and on the empathy map, you can start to build out personas. And personas are kind of groups of common people. It's one, you create one person out of a group of common elements and motivations and backgrounds of multiple people. You really want to focus in, not really their demographics, that's not so important in personas, potentially more important in things like marketing. but you really want to focus in on what their skills are, what their background are, what their motivations are, what their frustrations and their struggles are, because that's really where you start to pick up on the emotion of things that you can do to improve their situation, and yeah, things that you can do to identify key scenarios. Once you identify these key scenarios, you can start mapping them out. So you pick a start point, you pick an end point, and you can write down any questions that users have, any particular pain points users have in that scenario, and you can really identify the key points there. So this is what we call a journey map, where you just map the user behavior, and you can really pick out, just visualizing this some way just helps you identify which are the key areas that you can really focus in on your solution. From there, you can then reframe the opportunity a bit, and you may have started off with one particular idea and direction, but as you've started to understand more about your users and more about their journeys, you can start to kind of identify a real need. So as an example, if you initially started out picking a very kind of random and generic example, if you initially wanted to design a vase for someone, so people want to display flowers in their home, they have a vase to do that. That could have been your initial direction. You could have then kind of focused in on a particular user group. Let's say that you want to go for the elderly population because they're at home a bit more than other people, so they would make a bit more use out of this vase. You do a bit more observation of them, you can maybe interview them and kind of ask questions about, get them to describe times that they've enjoyed viewing flowers, get them to, when they've enjoyed nature, kind of take the context a bit wider. And then you can kind of focus in on that need statement and say, okay, well, elderly people perhaps maybe don't end up going outside as much, so what you want to do really is an elderly user who is homebound, they want to connect more with nature on the outside because they can't access that on their own very much anymore. So there I've described the situation, the outcome, and the motivation of that person. So going from my initial kind of, I want to design a vase, now my opportunity is actually a bit bigger because I actually just want to connect the elderly with the outside and nature a bit more. So from there, now that I've kind of got a maybe slightly wider and more innovative opportunity area, I can really start to think about different ideas on how I can solve that problem and create something out of that opportunity. So something to do in the ideation phase is really to just, quantity over quality is always best at this point. You can narrow it down later, but when you're trying to come up with ideas for something and doing brainstorming, quantity is always best, because your first idea tends not to be your best idea, and you have ideas that feed off of and jump off of other ideas, and you can build on top of them, you can strip them back. So yeah, my advice here is just to keep going, bounce a load of ideas off, and write them all down, stick them all in a spreadsheet, lots of different techniques for this. You can also involve other people. So if you can actually get some of your users and give them the opportunity statement and the need statement that you've just come up with, you can then get them to kind of input their own ideas as well. And they might be completely different to the initial idea that you had in mind. But it's about making sure that you've framed the opportunity in the right way that can start to spark those really good ideas. There's a video here that I don't know if it's going to play, but in Stockholm, they had a problem where they were getting congestion and crowding on the escalators in their subway stations. So they wanted to try and try and kind of come up with ways to reduce that overcrowding in the escalators. And just want to show this video to show the kind of idea they came up with, which you can kind of think definitely wouldn't have been their first idea, but based on some sort of ideation, they came up with this idea, which is really quite novel and shows the power of innovation with ideation. So I'll stop it there, but you can see that the initial problem they had was around overcrowding on the escalators and trying to get more people to use the stairs. And they did that in a really fun and innovative way. So rather than just going down the simple and obvious route of maybe replacing the stairs with another escalator, and they kind of expanded and did some ideation to come up with a really fun and novel idea that ended up solving the problem. So moving on to the iteration phase. So this is where we really start to think about usability. One of the really good examples of usability we have is the Norman doors. So Don Norman's one of the guys who coined the term user experience. And this example is really good at just showing some of the aspects and putting all the usability heuristics into place with the concept of doors, something that everyone uses every single day. And are just about making sure that you cover all aspects of usability. So the perfect door is one that has a perfect affordance of knowing whether you need to push or pull the door using either the flat pad or the handle. It usually has a glass element in the middle so that you can see through it, so you can see what's on the other side, so you know what you're expecting, and you can see if someone's going to be crossing your path coming through the other way as well. And we all know how annoying it is when we go up to a building or we go up to a door. Anyone who's been to the Tyk London office will know this, and you never know which way the door opens because there's kind of, they don't have the good usability aspect of the door. They don't have either the push or pull handle in the right place, and there's just no affordance really of which way it's going to go. So yeah, always think about the door and kind of what's going to have the best experience there. So these are the 10 usability heuristics of user experience. So visibility of system status. So this is just making sure that everyone's always making your users aware at all times, wherever they are in your kind of, whether it be a website, an application, a service, making sure they know what the status is at that time. Matching between the system and the real world. So people have mental models in their minds. As human beings, we actually really we focus well on hierarchies. That's kind of how we've been brought up in life, and that's in nature. A lot of things are kind of built in hierarchies. So that's something that's really important, to just make sure that you're always mapping whatever you're putting in a digital form or in a service form into the way that people would expect it to be in real life. User control and freedom. So this is all around making sure that the user always has a feeling of control in anything that they're being asked to do. As human beings, we are really we don't like putting control in other people's hands. So it's important to get that across on a system as well. Consistency and standards. This is a really important one. If a pattern already exists for something and that pattern can solve something that you're doing in your project, then just follow the pattern, because people don't really like learning new things. People expect things to be a certain way. It kind of goes back to the matching between system and real world. There are standards in the world. They're there for a reason. We shouldn't go against them just for the sake of it, unless you really think that it's going to enhance that person's experience and that you think that something you've come up with is way better. Then it's better to just stick with standards in some situations. Error prevention. So we know that errors do always happen, and we'll come on to a way to kind of combat that afterwards. But if you can prevent an error, then do. So the basic example of this is if you're asking your users to fill out a form, make sure, if you've got validation criteria, make sure that the user's aware of that. So when they're choosing a password, if there are password rules that you want them to comply with, then let them know before they just type anything in and then get shown an error. It's a really kind of frustrating thing for users. If there are rules, let them know up front so they can follow them. Recognition rather than recall. So don't just rely on the fact that after your user has gone through your service or gone through your product, then they'll just remember where everything is. It's very likely that the users that you're focusing on are going to have lots of different products and services that you use. and they just want to be able to recognize things. This is the importance of having really good navigation structures, again using hierarchies within those to make sure that users know where they are and where they can go, make sure they recognize what the actions are that they need to complete. Don't rely on them remembering things from previous experiences. The next one is around flexibility and efficiency of use. So whilst we want to make sure that users can kind of do exactly what they need in our product, we always want to provide kind of defaults as well. This is what I really get from this point, that you should always provide a default, but let users sway away from that default if they want to, if you allow them to, and if they really need to. But provide the default first. That makes it way more efficient. Aesthetic and minimalist design. So when people think of design and UX, the way that something looks is often the first thing that pops into their mind. And as you can see, this is just one of the points. And it is a really important one because as we do often judge a book by its cover. So something that is aesthetically pleasing, we're going to have a better experience with, just because actually as human beings, we are fairly shallow. So we do like the way things look. And yeah, there are studies actually as well that show that people are more likely to put up with some small usability issues if the screen that they're looking at is more aesthetically pleasing. So yeah, usability is obviously really important, but aesthetics are part of usability, and aesthetics do sometimes kind of probably come to the top of that list. The next one is about helping users recognize, diagnose and recover from errors. So point 5 was all about error prevention, but we do know that errors do happen. When they do happen, it's really important to tell the users why they've happened so that they know to recover from them and to not make those mistakes again. So error messaging is really important, and it should be really clear. It's a really important aspect of usability. And the last one is help and documentation. So in a lot of situations, you're not going to get everything across kind of in the exact screen that you're looking at. Always provide something else to help the users go that little bit further if they need the extra context and the extra information. So the last point is all around measuring UX. So we've spoken about making sure that you're solving the right problem and making sure you're solving the problem right. So this comes down to the usefulness of the product, which I would say is the very first thing. If something is not useful, then there's not really any point thinking about the usability of it, because people won't really use it if it's not useful. So it's kind of a chicken and egg situation here. So yeah, what will users get value from this? And you can determine that by making sure that you've really understood, making sure that you've defined the context, and making sure that you are solving a real problem for a real group of users. So once you've established that, you can then think about the effectiveness. So the effectiveness is about whether a user can actually complete the required task from the beginning to the end. So you know the outcome and the task that you want your users to complete once you've built your software or your project or your service. So a really good way to test this is just to measure whether people are able to complete that task. You can use usability testing for this, where you can set out a scenario and just watch someone do it. And see, don't give them any prompts or anything, and just see whether they can complete the task that you've designed for them. The next one is all about efficiency. So can someone complete it in the fastest way or the shortest possible path? So did someone kind of deviate and go a route that you didn't expect them, and therefore did it take longer to complete that task? So just kind of when you're doing usability testing, make sure that they are taking the most efficient route, and if not, then maybe try and course correct that in the next iteration. And the last point is around satisfaction. So there's lots of different ways to measure this. Kind of just gather from someone's face whether they're enjoying the experience or not. If you can see their face, you can do kind of NPS surveys, get people to rate on a number of 0 to 10 about whether they enjoyed the experience or not. So there's multiple different ways, or you can just ask them as well. But overall, this is about kind of good sentiment and attitude towards completing the tasks. Did they have an enjoyable experience? So these are all kind of just questions to ask yourself as you are going through your project, as you're going through your design, as you're doing any testing. Just answer these questions in the most effective way that you can, that you're going to get value from, to really understand whether the user experience is as good as it can be. So that is it from me, my whistle-stop tour of user experience. So happy to take any questions.
Awesome. Thanks a lot, Sophie. That was super informative. Yeah, so like Sophie mentioned, we're open to any questions that you might have about UX, about designing anything specific to your project, anything. We're open to any questions right now.
Okay, maybe I'll start with a quick one, because just keeping in mind the side project fund, there is a high probability where people may be starting off with a project midway. I think so. You touched upon that earlier on. So what could be a good process where we've already sort of built something or some version of the product out and we're kind of looking to extend it, as opposed to starting from scratch? What would the process look like for in that scenario?
Yeah, so I think a really good technique for that would be just putting your product or project in front of the person that you intended to use it, and then just observe and kind of map out how they've used it, and then pinpoint any places where you think that where it could be improved, based on either something that they really enjoy that you could extend, or something that they're having difficulty with that you can pull back. I think something that's really important when you're going through any sort of user testing or usability testing or observing someone using your product, we tend to kind of focus on the negatives quite a lot and think, oh no, they're not enjoying that bit, I need to kind of improve that. But another really good technique is to actually focus on the bits that they do really enjoy, or they are really getting a lot of value from, and think about how you can extend that bit, because it might be that that actually provides more value than removing the thing that was causing a slight frustration. So it's a bit of a balancing act there as well.
Okay.
I've got a question. So I used to work for an over 50s company for like seniors. They're only just sort of getting into their applications and technology really, and it's really ramping up. So how would you design with that in mind, thinking that these users potentially don't have like the technical experience that some younger folks do, or they might have accessibility issues and stuff like that? If you've got any advice on it.
So is it a product that only that user group use, or is it a product that's also used by the kind of more tech savvy groups as well?
So it's travel bookings through an app, basically. So some customers would have used the website before and will be sort of technically savvy and stuff. But we would have a larger percentage of users that are sort of retirement age and perhaps don't tend to use programs like that.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one. So one of the points I made around making sure you stick with patterns that are well known, there's kind of two sides to that. There's one, sticking to patterns that are well known in the tech world, which probably won't apply very much to that sort of user group because they're not aware of those patterns, so anything's going to be new to them. It's more about making sure that the patterns, you can kind of translate those patterns back to maybe more traditional systems. Using off the top of my head, kind of they're probably used to using actual physical phones and maybe books, so maybe try and take some of the aspects of those sorts of things that they are used to using and translate those into a design of an application, and just give a bit more, I think, prompts for those sorts of things. And then there's the more kind of obvious things around accessibility, making sure that font sizes are big enough or can be adjusted to be big enough for people with visual impairments, making sure that contrasts are in line with standards, so that again, people with visual impairments could see. If people have limited mobility physically, then making sure that things are big enough, or perhaps explore kind of voice interfaces rather than physical interfaces as well. So once you start really thinking about the things that it may be that actually in the first place an application is probably not the best thing for that sort of user group, and that they could explore different solutions that would be more suitable for that user group.
Cool. All right, that's really helpful. Thank you.
I have a quick question. You mentioned about the MRI machine example, right? I think I thought that was a really wonderful example. And it's also really wonderful because he knew to look for those signs, which is people rescheduling their appointments, there's a high delay and all of that, right? Like, how do you learn to look for these signs when it comes to, he could have just like, if it would have been me, I would have just like built the machine and delivered and just, that's all my job is, right? There's just trying to understand how do you spot those metrics.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not sure I fully know the answer. I think just in terms of your attitude, you just have to learn to be really curious about everything that you're doing. So he was invited in for like the launch of this machine in this hospital, and he just happened to see like the first kid that was using it was crying their eyes out. Their parents were trying to calm them down. I had to bring in an anaesthetist to come and sedate them. So all of these things he kind of just noticed, and then started to build up, I guess, just out of curiosity. Sometimes things are really obvious to notice. Someone might come to you and scream and say, this isn't working, I hate it. But sometimes things are really subtle, and it is just about learning to kind of pick up on those subtleties. And also back to what I was saying about embracing the awkward silences and embracing the awkward situations, that tends to be where you kind of pick things up from that wouldn't necessarily have surfaced.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think a lot of it also has to like do with experience, right? Like over the years, you sort of know what to look for.
Yeah, I think so. User experience is interesting. So there's obviously a career for user experience designers, otherwise I wouldn't have a job. But as I've mentioned here, it is something that anyone can kind of pick up on. I'm not saying that everyone can become an expert in it. I mean, I kind of think of it as a bit like home cooking. So everyone can cook a meal, everyone can kind of make edible food, but not everyone is a chef. So that's kind of the way I see it. Like user experience designers are like they're chefs, whereas other people were just learning to be a better home cook. And someday they might want to be a chef. Who knows? You might enjoy it so much.
Any other questions from anyone else? Because I have some questions.
I think I wanted to ask about the ideation process as well, because I think the tricky bit sometimes is that you obviously want to start with a problem, but at the end of, say, an ideation process, you should at least get to a point where you also are validating not ideas, but also validating the problem. That are you asking the right question or not? So how is there an effective process to be able to do that, to be able to evaluate that? Are you asking the right problem itself? Are you asking the right questions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Ideation can sometimes feel like a never-ending loop of, as you say, kind of come up with an idea. Is it the right one? Reevaluate, come back, come up with more ideas based on that. It really is just something you have to work through. You have to hope that you've kind of got enough information up front around all of that. Understanding that context is really like the key to like narrowing down your ideas to the right areas. Involving your target user group in that ideation is one of the most valuable things to do. It can be tricky depending on what type of service you're trying to design or what type of industry you're in. Bringing people into that process isn't always easy, but that is the absolute best thing to do, because it's kind of coming straight from the horse's mouth then. You can group different ideas together and then come up with kind of one kind of limited idea. This is kind of where the concept of MVP comes in as well. So you might have a really great idea and you think, yeah, that is 100% the direction I want to go. But then you should kind of just figure out what's a really slim kind of sliver of that problem, of that idea that I can produce and then validate if it is the right one, as you say.
Okay, great. Thank you.
There's also this emotional aspect of an idea, right? That you are so tied up to an idea that you think is the problem that you're looking to solve. It's like a personal
Yes.
problem versus an actual problem, right?
Yeah, yeah. That again is a skill that you just have to kind of learn. I think as designers, in especially, we're coming up with ideas and designs all the time, and then you have to kind of put yourself on the line by putting that idea out there and just waiting for people to kind of critique it in a good or a bad way. And you just have to learn to kind of take a step back, disassociate yourself from that idea, because it's an idea. It's, yes, it was your idea, but at the end of the day, you're trying to solve a problem for someone that isn't you, necessarily. So you need to get that empathy and look at it from their eyes and their situation. And yeah, it's a really difficult thing to do. So yeah, it's just, all I can say is just kind of try and not associate with yourself directly with that idea, and yeah, don't get too emotionally attached to them.
In those situations, would you say that having a team, or maybe being able to bounce ideas off somebody might be useful? Because
Yeah,
when you yourself may be attached, maybe you might get a bit more feedback with that.
yeah, I think as well, working with a group is good for a number of different things. I know for side projects, it's not always the case, but just involving, like, even friends, just getting people to come in and just validate and just have kind of set yourself up a safe space to get feedback from, so that you're kind of setting yourself up for that situation, and are expecting feedback like that.
In terms of observation and keeping out of the way, are there any tools that we can like use to do that? Especially if the project is virtual and online, maybe like an app or a website.
Yeah, so there are quite a few tools. So there's kind of the standard ones like Google Analytics. That is a way of observing what people are doing. So that's more quantitative data, any analytics tools in that sense. There are tools as well that you can use, that you can install, which means you can actually watch people using the screen. So you're not getting any kind of visual or audio feedback from that, but you can actually see people interacting with your product. Hotjar is one of those tools. Full Story is another one of those tools. Mouse Flow, I think, is another one. Yeah, there's quite a few where you can actually see visual recordings of people using your product.
Awesome, thanks.
Oh, we can't hear you anymore, sure.
Can you?
Oh, we can hear you now.
Yeah, Zoom's acting really weird today, as it does always. Just a question about user satisfaction. When would be like the right time to start measuring or doing like NPS surveys, or asking questions like pop-ups and all of that? Like, I don't want to get a pop-up immediately after I install an app. Like, the
Yeah.
first question is probably not the right time to do that.
Yeah. I would always say kind of, once someone's actually kind of got to the crux of the product, and they've been using it fairly regularly I mean, it really depends. Kind of, if the whole purpose of the product is to be in and out in 10 minutes, then you're going to kind of ask that in the 4th minute or so. Whereas if the whole point is someone kind of uses your product ongoing for a number of weeks, months, or years, then you want to stagger that out. But you can ask for satisfaction in different ways, either directly through the pop-up, or through kind of a marketing email, and reach out email directly, general contact. I would say the sooner you start finding that stuff out, the better. But yeah, just figure out the balance of not wanting to annoy people too early on, versus getting the feedback when you need to get it.
Awesome. Yeah, makes sense. Any last questions, anyone, before we leave? No, I guess that's all the questions that we have. Awesome. Thank you so much, Sophie. Thanks everyone for participating. Really appreciate all of your time. And we will follow up with an email with a recording to this workshop and the slides, if we can share that as well.
Yep.
Awesome. See you all online. Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Thanks.
All the best to everyone
Thank
for the
you.
side project as well. Thanks, Sophie.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.